I don't deny God, but if science proves his existence, I will gladly believe, truly and completely.
Well, I wouldn't say it's been categorically proven. No one was standing there with a movie camera from start to finish. That's why we always say that there are kind of,
Certain prerequisites.
yes, yes, some facts that point one way or another.
Yes, in that sense, I'm familiar with some similar theories. For example, the question is often asked, why are there such clearly defined physical boundaries in our world? That's quite a strong argument because we can't say for sure why our universe is structured this way. And the explanation involving some kind of creator can also seem quite logical, especially when we get down to the quantum level. There, it's complete magic. So why not believe in such magic?
I can throw in another thing for you. I don't know if you've heard about it or not. DNA.
DNA, well, yes, I've heard of it.
People didn't know about it. It's only been in the last few decades. And so much extensive and profound information has accumulated over time about the intricate structure of DNA that it now profoundly allows us to effectively utilize sophisticated mathematical models to precisely calculate, for example, whether it is even conceivably possible for such an incredibly complex and highly organized molecule to have spontaneously appeared purely by random chance. Or, in other words, what are the odds? And you can immediately calculate all of this. On the one hand, if we're talking about chemical compounds, those nucleotides ATCG, they're complex, of course, and even obtaining them is difficult. But the real question is that these nucleotides alternate in a specific sequence. This sequence determines not just anything, but the information according to which our eyes grow in certain places, our ears in others, how the heart beats, and so on, what the lungs are made of, and so forth. Everything is determined by this information. So for this particular part, there is now sufficient and comprehensive information available to accurately calculate the precise probability of its eventual emergence. Not the chemical elements once again, but specifically the information. Well, roughly speaking, let's say we're not talking about where it came from. Let's say we have several buckets of letters. We're talking about the need to arrange these letters into a certain sequence. For a tiny worm, this would be roughly equivalent to an astonishing 25 substantial volumes of books on both sides. These books would be meticulously printed, and each one about 1,000 pages thick, and we would indeed require 25 such comprehensive books. All of this vital information is carefully recorded within the pages of these books. So we're truly talking about arranging the individual letters in such a precise and meaningful way that it's not just a random jumble of characters, but actual coherent information, information that would profoundly allow a simple worm, not even a complex man, but a mere worm, to successfully live and thrive. And when they start calculating this probability, it turns out to be practically zero. That is, it's physically zero, not an absolute zero, but 0.0000, with hundreds of pages of zeros after the decimal point. In other words, it's a miracle of miracles, truly extraordinary. It's much more likely, by comparison, that if a garbage dump exploded, a Boeing would be formed from the explosion. That probability isn't zero either, but it's an extremely, extremely, extremely low probability. We're talking about precisely the same order of probability here, that DNA could not have possibly formed during the Earth's entire existence if it formed purely chaotically. There,
It's not a chaotic chain at all because if we're talking about that, sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt you.
no, no, all right, good.
As far as I know, DNA itself depends greatly on the specific species we're talking about, because, for example, even in man, there are segments of DNA that are not used, which also supports the theory of evolution and so on. And that's why primitive organisms could have had very short DNA chains.
Yes, for example, the complete and intricate DNA of a common bean plant turns out to be significantly larger than that of a tiny worm. And it really is there. But as for whether it's junk or not, when I first read about it, it was all considered junk. Then suddenly they started to find that no, not all of it is junk. That it could simply be, roughly speaking, those who have a lot of these kinds of modified copies, it's simply a history of adaptation. So basically, the more of them there are, the more adapted the organism is. But still, that doesn't change the fact that there is a minimal amount of DNA that determines functionality. If you take a single celled living organism, it still has to have a certain functionality. For example, digestion of food, reproduction, and so on. For various essential biological processes, there must be a minimal set of functions, and the code that describes this minimal functionality must also exist. So I could create a long program, but there is always a minimal program below which you can't go because the minimal functionality must be provided. And even these are still very large. For example, if we're talking about worms, the average number of nucleotides is about 100 million, but there are some with 20 or 30 million. Still, you can't go any lower. And this doesn't help Well, fine. Instead of 200 pages of zeros, let's say there will be 150 pages of zeros. Well, in my opinion, that's not much help.
In the theory of large numbers, actually, that's a very big help, especially when we're talking about time spans of billions of years.
For us, what's important is not so much the time, but the number of organisms that could have existed over the course of Earth's existence. And I've read several articles. If you ask ChatGPT right now, it'll give you something like 10 to the power of 38. But I've read, so to speak, the most conservative estimates. That is the maximum estimate of how many there could have been at most. In this case, the result was 10 to the 64th power. There was also a very interesting idea of panspermia. That is, that these didn't originate on our Earth, but somewhere else. And then somehow, with spores, they reached us.
And by the way, regarding the water, I also heard a rather intriguing theory that a foreign body, perhaps an extraterrestrial object, could have potentially brought it. However, I must admit, I personally didn't fully accept that particular explanation.
Well, it's good that you've heard about it. But in recent years, once again, you have kind of referred to the significant fact that now is exactly the time when science tries its best to be objective, but nowadays it wavers. At one time it said, no, a man can arise on their own. Now, among scientists, there are petitions circulating with thousands of signatures from professors who say that the theory of evolution works well to describe the adaptation of organisms, but it doesn't work at all to describe the process of development. In other words, it's useless. There is no mechanism there to describe the development from simple to complex. So the idea arises not of random mutations, but of an author. That is, they're not talking about God, they're talking about an agent with a capital A, or an author. It doesn't make any difference. I can call him the great programmer, but that doesn't really matter. The second fundamental theory that has truly and significantly challenged the very idea of evolution, and it is actually the Big Bang theory, almost everybody has heard of it. There are numerous experimental and comprehensive mathematical models. And as a result, the indeed widely accepted foundational model in science is called the very origin of our vast universe, the Big Bang theory. And it determines the age of our universe as a maximum of 14 billion years. To be precise, 13.8 billion years. That is billions of years. And this, roughly speaking, is only about 4 times greater, more or less, than the age of our Earth. So to say that life came from another planet doesn't really work either. This idea, so to speak, turns into a myth. In other words, it's a false assumption, a false hypothesis. So we need a different hypothesis. And this is precisely what I am talking about, that the fundamental hypothesis, which we are essentially saying that these genetic mutations are either entirely random or conversely not random at all. And today's, so to speak, prevailing scientific understanding and evidence strongly indicates that it is much, much more profoundly likely that they are indeed not random, because the probability, if they are not random, is 99.9999999, and that is quite significant.
Yes, I actually do understand quite clearly what you were saying about that particular theory regarding the very origin of life itself originating from outside of our own Earth. In fact, I don't particularly like it either, at least primarily because it's incredibly hard to truly believe that such delicate substances and organic compounds could have possibly survived an arduous journey through the vast emptiness of space and then a fiery turbulent entry into the atmosphere of Earth. When you specifically mentioned that extensive research is currently being actively conducted on the widely discussed Big Bang Theory, it's important to remember that the Big Bang Theory itself has, for a considerable period of time, long been heavily and consistently criticized by numerous prominent scientists within the scientific community. I mean, now they have launched telescopes.
The Hubble telescope.
Yes, I couldn't remember it at first. And there was some controversy, you could say,
Yes, I heard about this because I'm interested and it caught my attention, but yes.
and there were almost significant scandals. Like, that's absolutely it. Science is completely over.
But the scientists were the ones calming down the journalists. They say everything that's being written, you see it there on TikTok. And it's all nonsense. That is, yes, there is new data, but it doesn't break the main model. They just require the model to be adjusted a bit. So, well, it might turn out that, for example, the age of existence is not 14 billion years, but 30 billion years. For DNA, that means nothing at all. There's not enough time.
It's important for me to point out that this is exactly about probability theory. Unfortunately, our brain interprets probability theory in such a way that a 1 in 100 chance means that out of 100 tries, we are guaranteed to get one winning result. But with a 1 in a million chance, we could try just once and get that very win. It's just that our minds can't grasp it. I think it's a problem of comprehending infinity and things like that.
I understand what you're talking about, yes? So that one particular and specific case could potentially happen right away, almost instantaneously. But when we are talking about significant zeros stretching over several hundred extensive and detailed pages, it truly gets a bit complicated and quite challenging to manage indeed. Let me just give an example. So let's say you're standing on the edge of a skyscraper on the roof and you say, I'm going to jump now. And the probability that the wind will catch me and I'll land in a good zone, completely fine, not even breaking any bones, is say 0.00. But in principle, you're right. Hypothetically,
It's impossible to create such a situation, that's a fact.
but the nuance is that we build our lives based on this hypothesis. So is it worth it for you to jump because of that? But the real question is something else. It's that people, not only do you decide, and you might be sure, that's fine, but you start convincing others to do the same, to jump as well.